March 1945. The borders of the Thousand-Year Reich were collapsing, but the German High Command was still clinging to one final, desperate delusion. They believed they still had one shield left, the Rhine River. And to them, the Rhine was never just water. It was something bigger, something almost sacred, deep, fast, heavily fortified. A barrier wrapped not only in steel and concrete, but in mythology itself. For months, German propaganda had pounded the same message into the minds of civilians and soldiers alike. No invading army had crossed the Rhine into the German heartland since Napoleon. That was the story. That was the promise. And they believed that if they could just hold that river line, they could bleed the Americans and the British dry before they ever reached the core of Germany. But the truth is, the myth of the Rhine was not only alive inside Germany, even the Allied Supreme Command in Paris seemed to accept it. Generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower and British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery looked at the Rhine and saw a logistical nightmare. Really, they feared a massacre. So, the order went out across the theater. Halt! Stop the tanks. Stop the infantry. Wait for supplies. The plan was clear, careful, deliberate. Let Field Marshal Montgomery build up an overwhelming force of more than 1 million men in the north, then launch a slow, methodical, heavily publicized crossing a few weeks later. That was the approved strategy. That was the safe strategy. But down in the south, commanding the American Third Army, was General George S. Patton. And Patton did not believe in waiting. He did not believe in slow, methodical warfare. And he absolutely despised bureaucratic generals sitting safely in Paris, telling him when to stop fighting. When Patton looked at the mighty, supposedly impenetrable Rhine River, he did not see a mythological barrier. He saw a puddle standing between him and the destruction of the German military. When the direct order came, telling him to hold back and wait his turn, Patton did not argue. He did not complain. He did something far more dangerous. He simply cut his radio communications, stole thousands of gallons of gasoline, and decided he would show both the German High Command and his own superiors what real war looked like. And to understand just how outrageous that decision was, you have to understand the egos colliding inside the Allied command at that moment. In the north, Bernard Montgomery was preparing for Operation Plunder. Montgomery was the kind of commander who would not move one soldier unless he had a 3-to-1 advantage. For his Rhine crossing, he demanded 1.2 million men, millions of tons of supplies, 4,000 artillery pieces, and thousands of aircraft. He was treating the river crossing like D-Day all over again. In fact, he even invited British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to come watch it, almost like it was a grand military performance. But to assemble that mountain of strength, Montgomery demanded that Eisenhower shut down the fuel and ammunition pipelines going to the American armies in the South. And when Patton learned that his beloved Third Army was being halted, effectively benched, so Montgomery could take the glory, he was furious, violently furious. Patton's philosophy of war was brutally simple: speed, violence, relentless pressure, no apologies. He believed that if you kept the enemy running, they could never dig in, they could never recover, they could never breathe. His superiors told him, "George, you have to stop. You do not have the gas to reach the river, let alone cross it." Patton's answer became legendary. "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks got to have gas." The order, however, was official. He was to assume a defensive posture, but Patton spotted a loophole in the machinery of military bureaucracy. A commander could not launch a full-scale invasion without permission, but he could conduct a reconnaissance in force, a polished phrase that really meant sending a few men forward to see what the enemy was doing. Patton looked at his generals, smiled like a shark, and ordered a reconnaissance, but he did not send a few men. He sent the entire armored spearhead of the Third Army. There was just one problem. Officially, Patton's army had no gasoline. Supreme Command had cut the pipelines. But the men of the Third Army worshipped Patton, and really, they shared his contempt for red tape. If the bureaucrats would not give them fuel, then they would simply take it. Patton's supply officers became something close to state-sponsored pirates. They disguised their trucks, drove into the supply depots of the neighboring American First Army, and quietly rolled away with tens of thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. And when military police started noticing what was happening, Patton's men simply forged the transit papers and kept moving. Armed with stolen gas and deaf to every message from headquarters, Patton's tanks tore through the Palatinate region of Germany. The German defenders were caught completely off guard. They had been told by their own intelligence that the Americans were halted. They were expecting delay, caution, procedure. But what hit them instead was a tidal wave of American armor moving at highway speed. Patton's standing order to his tank commanders was savage in its simplicity. Drive until the engines die, then get out and walk. Do not stop for anything. By March 21st, 1945, while Montgomery was still hundreds of miles away preparing his massive and carefully staged operation, Patton's lead elements quietly rolled up to the western bank of the Rhine River near the town of Oppenheim. And what makes this moment so stunning is that the Germans on the opposite bank had no idea the Americans were there. This was the instant the German delusion began to crack. The German commanders at Oppenheim knew the Allies would eventually try to cross the Rhine, but they were expecting a spectacle. Days of artillery bombardment, thousands of aircraft roaring overhead, bombs falling in waves, a vast armada of boats smashing into the riverbank. That is how military academies teach a major river crossing. That is how armies are supposed to do it. But the reality was very different, and that difference is what broke them. On the night of March 22nd, Patton chose to do the exact opposite. There was no artillery barrage, no bombers in the sky, no thunder of preparation shaking the earth. It was eerie, silent, the kind of silence that makes a battlefield feel even more dangerous. Under the cover of pitch-black darkness, Patton ordered the 5th Infantry Division to simply paddle across, not in massive landing craft, not in a grand assault fleet, in small canvas assault boats. American soldiers slipped their paddles into the freezing water with almost no sound and moved across the mythical, impenetrable barrier of the German Empire as if they were sliding through a shadow. That is what makes this moment so unbelievable. The Rhine had been presented as the final wall, the untouchable line, the river that would stop any invader cold. But now, in the dead of night, men were crossing it quietly by hand, with canvas boats and raw nerve. The crossing was so silent, so casual in its execution, that the German sentries on the far bank did not even wake up until the first wave of American infantrymen was already climbing out of those boats and stepping into the German trenches. Think about that. The defenders were waiting for the apocalypse. Instead, they opened their eyes and found heavily armed American soldiers standing behind them with fixed bayonets. The shock was absolute. The defense of the Rhine, advertised for months as impenetrable, collapsed in minutes. In the entire initial crossing, the Americans lost exactly 0 men. 0. Patton had done what the greatest military planners in Europe insisted could not be done. He did it without permission, without a massive buildup, without a public announcement, and without making a single sound. Then came the next phase. By the following morning, American engineers were already moving with ruthless efficiency. They rapidly assembled a steel pontoon bridge across the river, turning a silent infantry crossing into a full-scale breakthrough. Once that bridge was in place, Patton's armored divisions began pouring across the Rhine and driving into the heart of Germany. At that point, the crossing was no longer just a tactical success. It became a humiliation on a grand scale. And George S. Patton understood humiliation as a weapon. On March 24th, he walked onto that pontoon bridge, wearing polished riding boots, his ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his waist, his helmet gleaming. He moved to the exact center of the bridge and looked down at the mighty, sacred Rhine River, the pride of the German Empire, the barrier Adolf Hitler had promised would never be breached. And Patton did not salute it. He did not pause for ceremony. He did not deliver some grand speech for history. In front of his men and in front of the cameras, General George S. Patton unzipped his pants and literally urinated into the Rhine River. That was not just mockery. It was a physical act of absolute, unfiltered contempt. He was sending a message that did not need translation. Your mythology means nothing to me. Your defenses mean nothing to me. I am already inside your house. And then, as if that were not enough, when Patton reached the far side of the river, he intentionally tripped and fell to his knees. He scooped up 2 handfuls of German dirt, rose to his feet, and declared, "Thus, William the Conqueror." It was theater, yes, but not empty theater. It was calculated disrespect, aimed directly at the historical grandeur the Germans held so dear. Patton was not merely crossing into Germany. He was trampling on the symbolism Germany had built around itself. But what makes this story even sharper, even more ruthless, is that Patton was not only humiliating the Germans, he was also humiliating his own side. At that exact moment, hundreds of miles to the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was finally launching Operation Plunder, his massive, expensive, carefully orchestrated Rhine crossing. The press was there. Winston Churchill was there. It was supposed to be a historic display of methodical Allied power, but Patton had already stolen the moment, quietly, brutally, completely, and he knew it. After crossing the Rhine and turning Germany's sacred barrier into a joke, Patton was not finished. Really, he was just getting started, because now that his Third Army was already east of the river, now that his tanks were pouring into the German heartland, he understood exactly what he had done. He had not only shattered the final psychological shield of the German High Command, he had also exposed the cautious, bureaucratic strategy of the Allied Supreme Command for what it was. So Patton walked over to a communications tent and dictated a telegram to be sent directly to General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Allied Supreme Command. The message was short, savage, impossible to ignore. I have just pissed in the Rhine River. For God's sake, send some gasoline. That single line captured everything: the contempt, the victory, the challenge. Patton was telling his superiors that while they were still debating, staging, calculating, and preparing, he was already across, already winning, already inside Germany. And then he made sure the humiliation would not stay private. He ordered his press officers to announce to the world that the American Third Army had already crossed the Rhine. In one move, he completely ruined Bernard Montgomery's carefully publicized moment of glory. The effect was explosive. The news slammed into Allied headquarters like a thunderbolt. General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, received the report and was stunned. Patton had crossed the Rhine without artillery preparation, without a massive buildup, and with virtually no casualties. Bradley instantly understood the deeper meaning of what had happened. Patton had just made the entire cautious strategy of the Allied command look foolish. And on the German side, the impact was even worse. When the German High Command received reports that American tanks were already operating east of the Rhine, something inside them finally broke. The river had been their last hope, their last illusion, their last story to tell themselves. If the Rhine could hold, perhaps Germany could still delay the inevitable. Perhaps the Allies could still be bloodied. Perhaps the heartland could still be defended. But Patton destroyed that fantasy with canvas boats, stolen gasoline, and pure audacity. That is the part that matters most. The Germans had prepared themselves for spectacle, for thunder, for a textbook invasion. What they got instead was silence in the night and Americans already in their trenches before they fully understood what was happening. Their so-called impenetrable defense had not been smashed in some glorious last stand. It had been bypassed, mocked, and rendered meaningless. And once that happened, morale collapsed with it. The war in Europe would continue for another 6 weeks, but the spirit of German resistance was already dead. Patton proved something brutal and simple. Wars are not won by bureaucrats sitting in offices drawing lines on maps. They are won by aggressive men willing to move faster than fear, faster than procedure, and faster than the enemy's ability to react. He had been told to hold back, told to wait his turn, told he did not have the fuel, told he did not have the authority. But the truth is, he answered every one of those restrictions in the harshest possible way. He stole fuel for his own army. He launched a so-called reconnaissance that was really a full armored thrust. He crossed the most heavily defended river in Europe in silence, and then he relieved himself on the pride of the German Empire. That is why this moment still stands as one of the greatest reality checks in modern warfare. Not only because it was successful, not only because it was bold, but because it obliterated myth. It stripped away propaganda. It crushed pride. It showed both enemies and allies that impossible obstacles often survive only because too many people agree to fear them. George S. Patton looked at the Rhine River, the final sacred shield of the Reich, and saw not destiny, not legend, not an untouchable fortress. He saw a puddle. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment, drop a like, and subscribe for more deep military history told the way it deserves to be told.